Along Amherst Avenue they sat outside the gates of the houses, shaking their Craven A tins like reformed smokers. Many displayed lurid wounds and deformities, but no one noticed them that afternoon. Refugees from the towns and villages around Shanghai were pouring into the city. Wooden carts and rickshaws crowded Amherst Avenue, each loaded with a peasant family's entire possessions. Petty clerks pushed bicycles loaded with mattresses, charcoal stoves, and sacks of rice. A legless beggar, his thorax strapped into a huge leather shoe, swung himself along the road through the maze of wheels, a wooden dumbbell in each hand. When they reached the Great Western Road exit from the international settlement, they found a queue of cars on both sides of the checkpoint. 2 soldiers cleared a space around a peasant woman whose cart they had overturned. Bayonet in hand, the sergeant slashed open a sack of rice which he scattered around the woman's feet. She stood shaking and crying in a sing-song voice, surrounded by the lines of polished Packards and Chryslers with their European passengers in fancy dress. Perhaps she had tried to smuggle a weapon through the checkpoint. There were Kuomintang and communist spies everywhere among the Chinese. Jim felt sorry for the peasant woman, whose sack of rice was probably her only possession, but at the same time he admired the Japanese. He liked their bravery and stoicism, and their sadness, which struck a curious chord with Jim, who was never sad. The Chinese, whom Jim knew well, were a cold and often cruel people, but in their superior way they stayed together, whereas every Japanese was alone. The queue of cars moved through the checkpoint, carrying groups of Americans and Europeans already late for their Christmas parties. Yang edged the Packard to the barrier, whistling with fear. A Japanese soldier was running the bayonet of his rifle across the windshield, as if cutting an invisible web. Jim knew that he would next lean through the passenger windows, venting into the Packard's interior his tired breath, and that threatening scent given off by all Japanese soldiers. Everyone then sat still, as the slightest move would produce a short pause followed by violent retribution. The previous year, when he was 10, Jim had nearly given Yang a heart attack by pointing his metal Spitfire into the face of a Japanese corporal and chanting, "Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat." For almost a minute, the corporal had stared at Jim's father without expression, nodding slowly to himself. His father was physically a strong man, but Jim knew that it was the kind of strength that came from playing tennis. When they arrived at Dr. Lockwood's isolated house, Jim was relieved to find that the party was not going to be a success. There were only a dozen cars in the drive, and their chauffeurs were hard at work polishing the dust from the fenders, eager for a quick getaway. Jim set out across the field. He climbed a wooden stile onto the floor of a dried-out rice paddy. Holding a balsa aircraft over his head, Jim ran along the floor of the paddy towards an iron building that stood on a ridge of higher ground 100 yards to the west. Overgrown by nettles and sugarcane, the remains of a concrete road passed a ruined gatehouse and then gave way to an open sea of wild grass. This was the aerodrome at Hongjiao, a place of magic for Jim, where the air ran with dreams and excitement. There was the galvanized hangar, but little else remained of this military airfield from which Chinese fighters had attacked the Japanese infantry columns advancing on Shanghai in 1937. A shallow ditch formed the southern edge of the airfield. Lying in the deep nettles was the fuselage of a single-engine Japanese fighter, perhaps shot down while trying to land on the grass runway. The wings, propeller, and tail section had been removed, but the cockpit remained intact, the rusting metal of the seat and controls blanched by the rain. But for all its rust, this Japanese fighter still belonged to the sky. Jim rested his balsa model on the engine cowling, climbed over the windshield and lowered himself into the metal seat. A potent atmosphere hovered over the cockpit, the only nostalgia that Jim had ever known, the intact memory of the pilot who had sat at its controls. Where was the pilot now? Jim pretended